Hey guys, tonight we are going to uncover a secret covered in the dust of time. A story that even history enthusiasts often overlook. When your mind scrolls through the tragic wives of King Henry VIII, you think of blood and betrayal, of the falling head of Anne Boleyn. But I want to ask you, what if I told you that the most agonizing tragedy belonged to a woman who wasn't executed, but was destroyed by cold rejection? That is Anne of Cleves, the queen whom the king called the Flanders Mare, and utterly despised from the very first sight. Just imagine, you are the Queen of England, but your husband, King Henry, is openly embracing a teenage girl right in the court, in front of you and everyone else. Worse still, because you are so innocent, you have no idea what is actually happening. You believe that marriage is simply about sharing a bed and wishing each other good night. Henry threw you away after only 6 months. But the incredible thing is, throughout the 17 years of solitude that followed, Anne still lived in the castles granted to her by Henry. When she died, her last will and testament revealed a heartbreaking truth about her forgotten kindness. And here is the thing that historians still debate. Although she was free, wealthy, and allowed to remarry, why did Anne live alone for the rest of her life? Was she afraid, or did she simply prefer her independence? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm really curious to know where you are watching from and what time it is. Please leave a comment so we can share this moment together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Henry VIII, the king famed for 6 tragic marriages, stepped into the Great Hall of Greenwich Palace on a winter morning in 1540, his heart brimming with the hope of beholding the face of his 4th wife, Princess Anne of Cleves. Unfortunately, the moment his eyes met hers, Henry exclaimed, "Ugly!" a cold echo, resounding through the candlelit splendor. From that first instant, Anne, then just 16 years old, wore the innocence and naivete of a girl who had never known political intrigue or the harshness of court, believing that marriage simply meant holding hands and saying goodnight each evening, unaware that life in those lavish castles concealed such ruthless calculation. The 4th princess soon realized that her marriage to Henry VIII was nothing like the fairy tales she had heard, yet her pure heart remained cloaked in innocence, so much so that she could not fathom why the king who had adored his previous wives was now so cold and severe. While Henry continued to promenade affectionately with the 16-year-old Lady Jane, daughter of the Earl of Surrey, before Anne and the entire court, Anne endured every envious glance and whispered reproach, yet she persisted in smiling gently, preserving the dignity of an empress. The palace became the place where she often sat silently by a window, gazing at the grey sky, secretly wishing for some miracle to alter the tragic fate she never desired. After only 6 months of marriage, the wedding had taken place on the 6th day of January in the year 1540, and by the 9th day of July of the same year, the annulment was officially sanctioned. Anne suddenly lost her title as queen. Henry VIII immediately stripped her of all privileges and released her to live as a princess of the English royal family, residing in vast but empty castles, thronged with servants yet utterly devoid of familial affection. For 17 years, from the moment her marriage was dissolved until she drew her last breath on the 16th day of July, in the year 1557, Anne endured a solitude so piercing that no home, no husband, only the pitying eyes of her attendants could dispel it. 17 years is no brief span, especially when each day passes like an endless dream with no escape. She moved among many great and small castles, from Richmond to Hever, then to Hampton Court, but no amount of opulent surroundings could soothe her ceaseless loneliness. The magnificent rooms, with their soaring ceilings and walls hung in brocade, felt chillingly empty in the absence of loving voices. Every dusk, Anne would stand by the window, watching the fading light of day and letting silent tears fall, as if seeking to cleanse the sorrow that reigned in her heart. When illness knocked and debilitating disease weakened her body, Anne still upheld the dignified bearing of a once queen. She died at the age of 41, leaving her final mark in a poignant will, with numbers and dates recorded meticulously, bearing witness to a solitary life spanning 17 autumns. In that will, she requested a solemn interment at Westminster Abbey, the the resting place of many earlier monarchs as a last desire to affirm the status she had lost after only 6 months. Her final instruction to her faithful servant was, "Each night, draw near my tomb and whisper a good-night blessing to me," the sole way she sought a measure of peace in her final rest. By the flickering candlelight, when the ink on those testamentary pages had dried, the story of Anne of Cleves, the woman history calls the loneliest queen, still echoed in the silent air. Those numbers and dates are not mere lifeless characters, but a reminder that behind the gleaming crown lay profound loneliness, that royal love could be so merciless. And perhaps, only when we release our hands and whisper ourselves a good night can we truly find a peaceful sleep. Anne was born in September 1515 at Swan Castle near Dusseldorf, the youngest daughter of Duke Johann II of Cleves and his wife Maria. Her birth was celebrated with fanfares and solemn mass in the chapel of the castle. Yet beneath the trumpet's call lay the quiet weight of expectation that a daughter of Cleves would one day govern with wisdom and grace. In the noble household of Cleves, women were entrusted with authority unusual for their era. They held dominion over estates, managed revenues, and were empowered to make political decisions when their husbands or fathers were absent. From her earliest days, Anne absorbed this matriarchal tradition as naturally as she drank from her nursing cup, learning that a ruler's strength could be born of compassion as well as command. Anne's childhood unfolded within the grey stone walls of Berg Castle, where she shared her lessons and leisure with 3 siblings, Sibylla, Wilhelm, and Amalia. Each day dawned with the clang of the great clock in the gatehouse, calling the children to gather in the hall for instruction. Sibylla, the eldest, learned scripture and statecraft alongside her. Wilhelm, the sole brother, trained in martial skills, and Amalia, the youngest, studied alongside Anne in music and embroidery. While most English princesses of the time were tutored solely in courtly etiquette and the recital of prayers, Anne's curriculum was remarkably broad. She studied property law under the retired Chancellor of Cleves, absorbing the intricacies of land tenure and inheritance. She learned the principles of taxation, calculating tithes and dues with quill and parchment, and mastered the management of a country estate, when to sow barley and when to reap rye. Beneath the vaulted ceilings of a candlelit chamber, she practiced the art of cookery with the head steward's wife, measuring spice and salt, simmering broths that would later grace her own banquet table. She sewed her own garments, stitching hems and embroidery with care, so that every fold of silk and taffeta bore the mark of her diligence. Yet Anne's education was not confined to hearth and ledger. She delighted in the open air, riding horseback across the rolling hills of her father's domains. She galloped alongside her brother and cousins, the wind tugging at her skirts, and she took part in family hunts, tracking deer through misty woodlands with a steady hand on her bow. Daily life at Berg followed a gentle rhythm designed to nurture both mind and spirit. Mornings were reserved for official business. Anne would pore over ledgers, attend councils with her father's advisors, or read dispatches from nearby courts. The pace was hushed, the quills scratching softly as the world awakened beyond the castle walls. Afternoons shifted to social exchanges and music. Anne sat among ladies of the household, listening to the lute and the harp, joining in song with a voice both clear and tender. She engaged in conversation about literature and theology, a soft smile upon her lips, learning to balance decorum with the spark of her own curiosity. Evenings were the grandest moments of the day. Long tables were set beneath chandeliers of wrought iron and dripping wax, the air filled with the scent of roast venison and fresh-baked bread. Feasts unfolded in 9 courses, each more elaborate than the last, and the hall welcomed 300 guests, nobles, envoys, and retainers alike, who mingled beneath tapestries depicting the lineage of Cleves. Amid the revelry, Anne moved with quiet grace, offering gentle words of welcome, observing the faces of those who partook of her family's hospitality. Though the laughter and music swirled around her, she felt the invisible ties that bound her to her heritage and to her responsibilities. Religion wove through the fabric of her upbringing with notable diversity. Her mother, Maria, adhered firmly to the rites of the Catholic Church, insisting on daily mass and devout confession. Her father, Johann II, secretly embraced the teachings of Luther, discussing them in hushed tones with select counsellors. Sibylla, Anne's older sister, declared herself a steadfast adherent of the Protestant Reformation, attending services that favoured scripture over ritual. Meanwhile, young Amalia exhibited a piety so fervent that she often led the household in morning prayer. Anne learned from each of them, witnessing how faith could unite or divide, and how belief demanded both conviction and compassion. This religious plurality instilled in Anne a pliancy of spirit that would serve her well in later years. She observed that a compassionate ruler could accommodate diverse convictions, guiding her people with tolerance rather than tyranny. Thus, in the soft glow of candlelight or the bright noon sun, Anne's heart grew both strong and supple, ready to meet the duties that lay ahead. By the time Anne of Cleves reached her 16th year, her mind was as richly cultivated as a well-tended orchard, ripe with knowledge of governance, culture, and faith. And though her life would soon be swept away from these familiar halls, the lessons learned at Swan and Berg castles would remain the foundations of her enduring legacy. When Anne reached the age of 11, a betrothal was arranged between her and the son of the Duke of Lorraine, a match that promised to strengthen Cleves's ties to the great duchies of the Rhineland. The engagement was formalized in the spring of 1526, and for 7 years she wore the mantle of a future duchess, attending ceremonies and learning the protocols of Lorraine's court. Yet in the summer of 1533, when Anne was now 18 years old, the betrothal was abruptly dissolved. Political winds had shifted, and the young prince was needed for an alliance elsewhere. So the promise of marriage slipped through Anne's fingers, leaving her with only memories of elaborate halls and distant flutes echoing through vaulted corridors. By the time Anne celebrated her 23rd birthday in September of 1538, her life had taken another irrevocable turn. Her father, Duke Johann II of Cleves, passed away on the 15th day of that month. His death thrust her younger brother Wilhelm to the ducal throne, and he assumed the mantle of power with solemn ceremony at Berg Castle. As Duke, Wilhelm held the authority to negotiate treaties, arrange marriages, and determine the course of his family's future. Anne, once poised to become Duchess of Lorraine, now stood at the mercy of her brother's political calculations, and she watched with a quiet heart as he prepared to wield that power. Meanwhile, in England, King Henry VIII had suffered the loss of Jane Seymour, his beloved third wife, who died in childbirth on the 30th day of October in the year 1537. Grief-stricken yet ever mindful of dynastic necessities, Henry sought a new marital alliance to bolster England's position on the continent. His chief minister, the ever-ambitious Thomas Cromwell, saw in Cleves the perfect partner, a duchy whose favour would balance the might of both France and the Holy Roman Empire. With eager determination, Cromwell dispatched envoys to Dusseldorf carrying flattering portraits of Henry and promises of friendship. By the autumn of 1539, Cromwell proposed a diplomatic gambit of singular boldness. He would bring Anne and her 2 elder sisters, Sibylla and Amalia, to a private audience with the king, allowing Henry to choose which sister he would take as queen. Wilhelm, cautious yet cognizant of Cleves's needs, agreed to the plan, stipulating no dowry beyond a payment of 100,000 florins, a sum he deemed sufficient to underwrite the alliance and demonstrate Cleves's goodwill. Remarkably, he waived any further demands, trusting that Henry's honour would secure his sister's future. All the while, neither Anne nor her sisters were consulted as to their preferences. Their own feelings were secondary to the imperatives of statecraft. Anne, for her part, met the news with a mixture of exhilaration and naivete. She had never imagined that one day she might be beckoned to the court of England, across the sea, to stand beside one of Europe's most powerful monarchs. In her mind's eye she saw grand processions, lavish banquets, and the strange but thrilling possibility of wearing England's crown. Yet she had no inkling of the trials that awaited her, the forced scrutiny of her likeness, the perilous journey across stormy seas, and the lonely days spent waiting for a verdict on her worthiness as queen. On the 1st of November, in the year 1539, Anne took her leave of her mother Maria and of her sisters at Swan Castle. The morning air was crisp as she embraced them in the courtyard, the ancient stones echoing the hurried clatter of hooves and carriage wheels. She climbed into a gilded coach, her heart fluttering like a captive bird, while her mother pressed a handkerchief to her lips to stifle a final sob. Sibylla and Amalia, faces pale beneath their dark veils, bid her farewell with trembling voices. Anne stepped away without looking back, for she understood that she would never return to the green hills of Cleves. The journey across the Channel was fraught with difficulty. Autumn storms roiled the North Sea, and the ship that carried Anne was delayed for days in the harbour of Calais. She disembarked onto damp cobblestones beneath a slate-grey sky, her skirts heavy with sea spray, and she waited alongside Cromwell's retinue in a shabby lodging near the castle gate. Each dawn brought the hope of fair winds and clear skies, yet each evening found her pacing the narrow rooms, longing for news of her passage to England. Finally, on the 18th of November, a lull in the tempest allowed the vessel to set sail. Anne boarded once more, her heart pounding as the shore of France receded into mist. She leaned against the rail, eyes half closed against the chill wind, imagining the vast expanse of the Channel as a gateway to a new destiny, or perhaps a passage to an unknown exile. As the ship pitched southward, Anne whispered a soft prayer, that she might meet her fate with courage, and that her name, once the promise of Cleves's matriarchal legacy, might yet find peace amid the turbulent courts of England. When Anne set foot on English soil in late December of 1539, she found herself greeted by crowds whose cheers rose like a gentle tide along the riverbank. Commoners and courtiers alike lined the quay at Dover, waving kerchiefs and banners, their voices raised in a single chorus. "Welcome the Princess of Cleves." Letters poured into court from every corner of the realm, penned by noblemen and ladies who lauded her beauty as though painted by the master Hans Holbein himself. They spoke of her statuesque figure, standing at 5 feet 10 inches tall, her clear blue eyes, and hair the colour of ripe wheat under the summer sun, all of which seemed to glimmer, even in the grey English winter light. The wedding had been solemnly planned for Christmas Day of 1539, yet diplomatic obstacles and winter storms forced the date to be postponed until the 6th day of January in the year 1540. Nevertheless, King Henry VIII's impatience could not abide such delay. In the weeks that followed Anne's arrival at Greenwich Palace, he contrived a most romantic stratagem. On the 1st day of January 1540, New Year's Day, Henry disguised himself as a humble courtier and slipped into Anne's private chamber at dawn. Clad in simple doublet and hose rather than regal robes, he knelt with a flourish and raised her hand to his lips, murmuring sweet compliments and hoping she would perceive in him the promise of her destined other half. Anne, startled by the sudden intrusion of this unknown gentleman, recoiled at the intimate gesture. To her, the man before her was a stranger, and she bristled at what she mistook for a salacious jest. With eyes wide and breath caught in her throat, she barely managed a curt refusal before he rose in confusion and hastily withdrew. It was only when he re-entered the chamber moments later this time, attired in his full royal regalia, majestic robes of deep purple trimmed with ermine, that Anne realized the truth. The gallant suitor had been none other than her sovereign. She sank to one knee, her heart pounding like a distant drum, and bowed her head in fearful obeisance. Henry offered a perfunctory kiss upon her unresisting cheek, his lips cold and formal, then turned and swept from the room as silently as he had come. Anne was left standing amid the carved oak panels and tapestries, her mind reeling from astonishment and embarrassment. The flicker of torchlight cast long shadows across the chamber floor, and she felt the weight of every whispered rumour that would surely follow such an occasion. In that moment, she realised that beneath the courtly pageantry lay a more calculating heart, one capable of both grandeur and humiliation. Upon returning to Greenwich, Henry's mood darkened. He paced the galleries with thunderous steps, recalling each detail of Anne's form. In private, he criticised her proportions and complexion, comparing her unfavourably to the portrait he had received, and to the ideal of youthful virginity that he deemed essential in a queen. Rumours soon surfaced that he suspected Anne was no longer pure, though there was no evidence beyond his own capricious judgments. The stage was thus set for Cromwell and the king's other advisers to fashion a casus belli for annulment, charges of non-consummation, misrepresentation of appearance, and lack of the requisite dowry. Throughout the court, courtiers whispered of Henry's fury. Some said he had declared Anne foul-faced and unworthy, while others heard him lament that he had been deceived by likenesses painted on canvas. The machinery of annulment moved swiftly. Interrogations of servants were arranged, and secret inquiries conducted into Anne's past. Yet even as these manoeuvres gathered momentum, Anne herself remained outwardly composed, determined to maintain the dignity befitting a future queen. She continued to attend chapel services at Street, Mary's her voice soft in the penitential hymns, and received guests in the great hall with reserved courtesy. By the time the court returned to Whitehall for the Feast of Epiphany on the 6th of January 1540, the rumour mills churned ceaselessly. Gentlewomen speculated over jewelled goblets of spiced wine, while chamberlains and footmen exchanged knowing glances in the corridors. Anne processed this undercurrent of disquiet with quiet resolve, even as her heart sank at the thought that the alliance between Cleves and England might be unravelling as swiftly as it had been woven. And so, in the cold dawn of January the 1st, when the king knelt before her in humble guise, Anne of Cleves unwittingly became enmeshed in a drama of expectation and disdain, one that would soon lead to the dissolution of her marriage and the redefinition of her place in history. Though the events were cloaked in ceremony and courtly ritual, at their core they rested upon a king's caprice and a woman's reluctant awakening to the perilous currents of Tudor politics. The world she had stepped into was at once splendid and treacherous, and the path of her destiny lay veiled in uncertainty. On the 6th day of January, in the year 1540, the wedding ceremony of Anne of Cleves and King Henry VIII proceeded in all its pageantry at Greenwich Palace, despite the king's private misgivings. The chapel at St. Mary's was bedecked with evergreens and flickering candles, and Anne, resplendent in a gown of pale lavender silk, walked beneath the vaulted arches with measured grace. Though the union had already been consigned to history's footnotes, the ritual had to be performed in full to preserve the prestige of England's alliance with Cleves. The following day, Thomas Cromwell, ever cautious, approached the king in the privy chamber and ventured to inquire after the consummation of the marriage. With a grim expression, Henry replied with merciless candour. He described Anne's person as lacking the essential virtues of a queen's form, and declared himself unable to gather the flower of her maidenhead, as required by their pact. His words rang coldly in the chamber. By invoking the ancient clause in Anne's prior betrothal to the Duke of Lorraine, that two parties must be free to consummate marriage, Henry established a legal ground for annulment. Yet Henry, ever mindful of appearances, did not abandon the ceremonies that very evening. He dined with Anne in the presence chamber before the firelight, served by liveried pages bearing silver goblets of spiced wine and dishes of roast capon glazed with honey. They sat side by side on crimson cushions at the long table, and courtiers, tasked with preserving the illusion of a happy union, exchanged silent toasts and polite smiles. Outside the palace walls, London's alleys buzzed with gossip. Does our new queen know what marriage truly means? They speculated in taverns and merchant houses alike. To such talk Anne, still cloaked in innocence, replied with gentle confusion, "He kissed my hand, held it close, and bade me good night. Surely that is the seal of husband and wife." She spoke softly, as though reciting a prayer, unaware that each word was being catalogued by spies of the court. She did not realize that her genuine naivete had become an instrument in a performance orchestrated by the king himself. By the time spring unfurled its first blossoms in the year 1540, Henry's attention had already drifted elsewhere. Reports reached the court that he had made an unsolicited visit across the River Thames to Lambeth Palace, where he spent days in the company of a young lady of just 16 years, his cousin Catherine Howard, daughter of the Duke of Norfolk. This clandestine sojourn sparked uproar among the populace. Newspapers in print only for a few sheets at a time carried verses lamenting poor Anne's fate, while commoners in the streets muttered, "Our queen sits dressed in finery, yet her husband's heart sails down the river to another." Anne, protected by the protocols of her station, remained ignorant of the full extent of the king's abandonment. She moved through her days in the royal household, much as she had in Cleves, rising with the maidens at dawn, attending chapel services in her quiet voice, and taking her meals in private with gentle courtesy. Yet beneath the surface of her composed facade, a tremor of bewilderment must have stirred. Why did the king neglect his queen? Why did he seek the company of a country girl barely a child? In April of 1540, the courtiers' whispers grew bolder. Lady-in-waiting and footmen alike exchanged knowing glances whenever Anne passed, and the Duke of Norfolk's messengers were seen slipping through corridors with urgent dispatches. Although no formal declaration of annulment had yet been pronounced, the machinery of separation was already in motion. Secret interrogations of Anne's former attendants in Cleves, discreet surveys of her dowry's terms, and private consultations with canon lawyers who prepared the legal instruments needed to dissolve the marriage. Through it all, Anne maintained her unruffled composure. She greeted her ladies with serene smiles, inquired tenderly after the health of her servants, and practiced her lute in the gallery's soft dusk, the notes trailing like whispered prayers against the stone walls. In public, she wore the mantle of queenship with dignity. In private, she retired early to her chambers, where she would sit by the window under a single candle, gazing at the early buds on the courtyard shrubs, and wonder at the strange currents that had carried her so far from home. By the close of spring in 1540, it was clear that the marriage between Henry VIII and Anne of Cleves was a union in name, only a political contract, unravelling faster than the silken threads of her ceremonial gowns. Anne, still innocent of the king's full designs, remained lodged in Greenwich Palace, a queen without a husband's favour, caught in a drama not of her own making. The sunlight that streamed through the stained glass windows fell upon her in gentle patterns of rose and gold, as though nature itself wished to console her. And so, amid the whispers and the shadows of court intrigue, Anne awaited whatever fate the king would decree, next her heart heavy with confusion, yet steadfast in the quiet strength that had carried her from Swan Castle to the heart of Tudor England. In the early days of June 1540, King Henry VIII contrived a pretext of plague to send Anne of Cleves away from Greenwich Palace to Richmond Palace. Royal proclamations warned of contagion, and servants in silk masks and gloves escorted her through deserted corridors. Yet Londoners quickly saw through the ruse. No one else was confined, and the king himself continued his courtly entertainments. The common gossip ran, "Surely this so-called plague spares every soul but the queen." Aye, fewer than 3 weeks later, a sealed parchment arrived at Anne's chamber door. With trembling fingers, she broke the royal seal and read the summons. Her marriage was to be dissolved because it had never been consummated, and her prior betrothal to the Duke of Lorraine still held legal force. The language was stern. She must accept the annulment or face grave consequences. Overcome, Anne sank to her knees and wept bitterly, her tears dampening the velvet cushions. Yet within moments, she steeled herself, drawing up her slender shoulders as though to brace against a coming storm. That very afternoon she summoned the Cleves ambassador, a rare friend amid the alien grandeur of the Tudor court. In a hushed council room lit by late afternoon sun, Anne spoke plainly. "I wish to preserve my honour and our family's reputation. I will negotiate terms that spare us both shame." By the next day, her resolve forced swift action. The ambassador returned to the king's ministers, bearing Anne's acquiescence to the annulment, seeking only a dignified settlement. Henry, taken aback by her quiet humility, confessed that he had expected a furious contest. Instead, he found a patient compliance that left him momentarily speechless. On the 12th day of July in the year 1540, King Henry's proclamation detailed the generous terms he would grant his soon-to-be former wife. Anne could choose to return to her homeland in Cleves or remain in England, as she preferred. She would receive an annual income of £4,000, a princely fortune in Tudor times, along with several estates and palaces. Richmond Palace itself, Bletchingley Manor, and Hever Castle, the very childhood home of Anne Boleyn. The king declared that Anne's honour was unimpeached. She remained a virgin, officially restoring her to the title of the king's beloved sister, placing her in precedence immediately after the reigning queen and the royal princesses. Overwhelmed with relief, Anne bowed deeply and expressed her heartfelt gratitude. She even pledged to allow the king to inspect her letters before she sent them to her family, a gesture of trust and respect almost unheard of among displaced royals. This act of transparency delighted Henry, reassuring him that no further intrigues would arise from Cleves. Thus, in a single breath, Anne became the freest woman in England, unwed, unchained by parental or fraternal authority, and endowed with wealth enough to live independently. Following the annulment, Anne withdrew from the political stage. She took up residence at her new estates, where she oversaw her household with kindness. Servants recalled her gentle manner, the soft way she would send for a cold bowl of milk for a child, or discreetly slip coins into a poor tenant's hand. Her fame as a benevolent lady spread through the countryside, and travellers spoke of the gentle Duchess of Richmond, whose laughter was said to ring like church bells at dawn. Anne's relationship with Henry's subsequent wives remained cordial. She attended the nuptials of Catherine Howard, smiling with polite warmth despite the court's hushed speculations. Some whispered that her serene presence was a subtle rebuke to any who dared mistreat England's young queen. Later, when Henry wedded Catherine Parr, Anne once again appeared at the coronation banquet, standing beside the new queen in robes of pale blue. Observers noted the compassion in her gaze, as though she felt sympathy for another woman ensnared in a king's affection. Perhaps most striking was Anne's bond with Henry's three children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. Mary, once suspicious of her stepmother, grew fond of Anne's steady kindness. They walked the gardens of Richmond together, Anne teaching her how to press wildflowers between parchment. With Elizabeth, Anne shared whispered stories of life in Cleves, while Edward, then a young boy of 5, adored the way she read to him in German lullabies. In time, Anne became known as the good stepmother, her gentle guidance helping to soften the court's more bitter edges. Yet even amid her comforts, Anne found herself searching for purpose. The grand halls of Hever Castle echoed emptily at dusk, and lavish gardens could not fill the void left by her thwarted queenship. No great diplomatic mission beckoned. No cause stirred her heart with the urgency of youth. Her days passed in measured routine. Morning devotions, handwritten accounts of her lands, afternoon visits to tenants, evening new Latin verses composed by candlelight. Thus, in the quiet interlude of her life, Anne of Cleves carried the lingering ache of solitude, a subtle, persistent echo in the chambers of a woman once called the loneliest queen. Though her name lived on in statutes and royal records, only she felt the soft pang that no title or fortune could fully cure. And so, beneath the glow of her hearth at Richmond, she closed her eyes each night, whispering a tender prayer for peace to soothe the gentle ache of her heart. After her annulment, Anne of Cleves settled into a life of independence upon the estates granted her by King Henry. Yet the shifting tides of politics and religion under subsequent Tudor monarchs demanded that she, like a weathercock, turn with every breeze. During the reign of King Edward VI, 1547 through 1553, Anne appeared at courtly ceremonies and bore witness to the young king's accession. In public declarations, she professed adherence to the Reformed Church of England, embracing the theological innovations that sought to realign the English faith with Protestant ideals. This confession would have seemed natural to one raised in a family where her mother's adherence to Catholic rites coexisted with her father's sympathies for the teachings of Martin Luther. Anne's attendance at Edward's coronation in January of 1547 was marked by her presence in the grand procession through Westminster. Records note her donning of a gown of pale green damask, its sleeves slashed to reveal fine linen, a subtle nod to the reformers' disdain for ostentation. As the service commenced, she knelt before the altar with a quiet dignity and joined the congregation in singing paraphrases of psalms newly translated into English. In lying low during this period, Anne managed to maintain favour. No pamphlets accused her of popish sympathies, and no courtier whispered of her as an enemy of the gospel. Yet the death of Edward, on the 6th day of July in 1553, brought a sudden reversal. With the accession of Queen Mary I, 1553 through 1558, England swung back toward Rome. Mary's fervent restoration of Catholicism compelled Anne to realign her own loyalties. Within weeks of Mary's coronation, Anne announced her reconciliation with the Holy See, attending Mass in the chapel at St. James's Palace, and observing the rites of confession and penance. To observers, her conversion appeared as much an act of deference to the crown as a return to childhood memories of her mother's devotions. This demonstration of fealty, however, could not shield Anne from the storm that would break in 1554. That spring, Sir Thomas Wyatt the Younger led a rebellion in Kent, proclaiming opposition to Queen Mary's proposed marriage to Philip II of Spain. Rumours circulated swiftly that Anne of Cleves, known for her prior Protestant allegiance, harboured sympathies with the insurgents. Though no concrete evidence tied her to the plot, the mere suggestion was enough to cast her into disfavour. In a discreet but unmistakable manoeuvre, royal orders forbade her attendance at court functions, restricting her movements to the confines of her properties. Honours once lavished upon her, such as attendance at banquets and the right to bear royal banners, were quietly revoked. As Anne found herself gradually excluded from the centre of power, she never again reclaimed the public prominence she had briefly enjoyed. The grand halls of Westminster and Greenwich, once open for her to stroll beneath gilt ceilings, were replaced by the simpler comforts of manor houses far from London. Though her coffers remained ample, and her retainers continued to salute her with loyalty, she felt the chill of isolation. Even in the warmest summer months, the air within her estate seemed tinged with the memory of that first bewildering journey to England. Throughout these trials, Anne recognized that religion had become not merely a matter of conscience, but a vital instrument of survival. Each shift of the throne required her to adopt a new confession, ensuring her material security and safeguarding her household. In doing so, she avoided the fates of others, most notably Catherine Howard, whose scandal and Protestant inclinations led to her execution in 1554. Yet Anne's own accommodation left her adrift, without a steadfast spiritual anchor, and ever cautious of the next change in doctrine. By the winter of 1556, Anne had settled fully into her role as a retired noblewoman. She corresponded with chaplains of both persuasions, signing letters with deference to whichever creed prevailed at court. Her estates flourished under her watchful eye. Harvests of wheat and barley yielded bounteous returns, and tenants spoke with gratitude of her fair rents and timely dispensation of charity during lean seasons. But the applause of the fields and barns could not fill the void left by her absence from royal councils. When Elizabeth I ascended the throne in November of 1558, Anne once more made a public profession of Protestant faith, aligning herself with the Church of England as re-established under the new Queen. Yet by then, her role had become largely ceremonial. She was invited to the opening of Elizabeth's first Parliament, but declined, preferring the quiet of her gardens at Richmond and the gentle cadence of verses she wrote in her journal at dusk. Thus, Anne of Cleves lived out her days in relative seclusion, a woman of immense wealth and courtesy but without a permanent place in the ever-turning wheel of courtly favour. Her adaptability spared her from the scaffold, yet it also deprived her of sure ground. In the soft glow of candlelight on winter evenings, she would often gaze at a portrait of her younger self painted years ago, by Hans Holbein's workshop, and reflect on the lonely journey from Swan Castle to the heart of Tudor intrigue. Though her name endures in history as the once-forsaken queen, only she fully knew the cost of a life spent bending like a reed in the shifting winds of power and belief. In the spring of 1557, Anne of Cleves began to feel her strength ebb away. Her complexion grew pale and drawn, her frame slender to the point of frailty, and she lost all appetite for the rich fare once served at her table. Modern historians surmise that she was suffering from advanced cancer, a malady for which 16th-century medicine offered no remedy. Anne took residence at Chelsea Manor, where devoted servants tended her every need, yet no blood relations stood at her side. Her mother, father and siblings remained in Cleves, the land she had not seen for more than 18 years. On the 12th day of July, in the year 1557, Anne recognised that her final hour approached. Over the next 4 days, from the 12th through the 15th of July, she summoned her most trusted attendants and her legal counsel to her bedside. By the light of flickering candles, she laboured to dictate her last will and testament, the document that would lay bare the depths of her compassion and the echoes of her long suffering. First, she provided detailed instructions for her interment at Westminster Abbey under the rites of the Catholic Church, for despite her shifts in confession, she wished her final rest in the familiar solemnity of her youth. Having ensured her burial would follow sacred tradition, Anne turned to the debts of her household. She ordered that all rents from her estates be collected up to the 29th of September and applied first and foremost to the settlement of any outstanding obligations. Should rents prove insufficient, she directed that her jewellery, gowns, and even her stock of oxen be sold to satisfy creditors. This pragmatic provision revealed a woman unwilling to leave those she employed bearing financial burdens due to her passing. Anne's will then unfolded in 4 distinct sections, each reflecting her abiding concern for different circles of her life. In the first, she set aside a full year's wages for 18 gentlewomen who had served her with unwavering loyalty. 8 gentlemen of her household were each to receive an equivalent sum, and even the royal children of the court, little Princess Mary, Princess Elizabeth, and the young Lord Edward, were not forgotten. Each child was to be given 20 shillings for the purchase of books or clothing. Special mention was made of 8 German servants who had accompanied her from Cleves in the summer of 1540. Each was to be granted 40 shillings to facilitate their return home, a testament to Anne's deep sympathy for those exiles so far from their native land. The second section addressed the poor on her manors at Richmond, Bletchingley, Hever and Dartford. To each impoverished soul dwelling upon those estates, she bequeathed £4, a staggering gift, in an age when few noble wills acknowledged the needy so directly. She ordained that funds be reserved for the education of indigent children, ensuring that even the humblest might learn to read and write. Such charitable foresight marked Anne as exceptional among her contemporaries, for few of her station endowed schools or took responsibility for the welfare of the common folk. In the third section, Anne turned her mind to friends and allies. She entrusted the Archbishop of York, the Earl of Arundel, and 2 faithful knights with the execution of her will. To these powerful men she bequeathed her gold plate and exquisite cups, objects she had cherished in life, so that they might serve as memorials to her memory rather than as tokens of sorrow. Finally, the fourth section revealed the tenderness hidden beneath her regal bearing. Anne distributed a collection of rings, engraved with the letters H and I, their meaning still debated by scholars, to her brother Wilhelm and her sisters Sibylla and Amalia, evoking memories of their childhood at Swan Castle. She also bestowed precious rings upon her foster daughter Dorothy Curzon, whose service had been constant, and requested that Princess Mary act as guardian to Dorothy after her passing. To Princess Elizabeth, she left a small book of German prayers, recalling the lullabies she once sang to her. Anne of Cleves's will, thus composed over those 4 sombre days, was more than a mere division of goods. It stands as the final testament of a woman who had known profound isolation and yet lived to care for others until her last breath. In her handwritten words, she sought to ensure that none of her servants, her neighbours, or her friends would be abandoned in her absence, an echo of the anguish she endured when cast aside in her youth. As her hand trembled over the closing lines, Anne of Cleves gave voice to her deepest humanity, leaving behind a legacy of empathy that resonates across the centuries. In the pale summer dawn of the 16th day of July in the year 1557, Anne of Cleves drew her final breath at Chelsea Manor, just 4 days after completing the will that would bear witness to her compassionate heart. She was 41 years old, having survived a life marked by unexpected exile and gracious endurance. 17 years had elapsed since the annulment of her marriage to King Henry VIII, a period in which she possessed every material comfort, yet truly owned none of it. The palaces granted to her for lifelong residence, Richmond Palace, Bletchingley Manor, and Hever Castle, were merely stately refuges without permanence. Upon her passing, each returned to the Crown's control, leaving no ancestral home to bear her name. Anne left no children to carry on her line. She had no heir to inherit her lands. Like a distinguished houseguest, she dwelt in luxury, yet remained, in the end, an impermanent presence at the centre of Tudor authority. The estates she managed so wisely during her lifetime fell silent without her guiding hand, and their walls retained only the echoes of her measured footsteps and gentle laughter. Yet Anne's true legacy was not carved from stone or minted in coin, but woven into the deeds of kindness she performed. Her final testament embodied a spiritual inheritance of remarkable breadth. The generosity extended to her servants and tenants, the charity bestowed upon the poor, and the careful diplomacy with shifting religious currents. These qualities transcended any crown, proving that an individual's worth can eclipse the splendour of a throne. Throughout her years in England, Anne skillfully balanced multiple roles. As the king's beloved sister, she occupied a rank just below the reigning queen and above the princesses. She served as a stepmother to Princes Mary and Elizabeth and to Prince Edward, forging gentle bonds that softened courtly rivalries. In her quiet way, she acted as protector and confidant to those caught in the turbulence of Tudor politics, offering shelter to petitioners and solace to the vulnerable. Upon Anne's death, her body was conveyed with solemn procession to Westminster Abbey, the ancient repository of English royalty. There she was laid to rest, near the tombs of Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth, an enduring testament to her loyalty and to the subtle authority she wielded through empathy rather than force. In that consecrated space, Anne's stone sarcophagus once bore only blank panels where her name should have been. Generations passed before, in the 1970s of the 20th century, her identity was finally inscribed upon the marble, fulfilling an almost prophetic truth. While history may neglect a gentle spirit, the kind heart will ultimately be remembered. Anne of Cleves's life and her dignified departure offer profound lessons in self-respect and the resilience of the human spirit. Though she was cast aside by a king's caprice, she refused bitterness. Though she held titles bestowed by royal decree, she anchored her sense of self in acts of service. Her adaptability to England's religious upheavals, first embracing Protestant reforms under Edward, then returning to Catholic observance under Mary, and once more affirming the Elizabethan settlement, demonstrated her commitment to unity and peace above doctrinal rigidity. Her benevolence to her household and to the commoners in her domains stands as a model for leaders of all ages. In allocating the equivalent of a year's wages to her gentlewomen and gentlemen, in providing £4 to each impoverished resident on her manors, and in ensuring German servants could return home, Anne affirmed that responsibility to one's fellow beings transcends rank. Her endowment for children's schooling in the 16th century, an almost revolutionary act, reveals her forward-looking concern for future generations. Though the palaces that sheltered her have long since passed into other hands, and the name Anne of Cleves may evoke little more than a footnote in the annals of Tudor monarchs, her spirit endures in the principles she embodied. Her story reminds us that true nobility arises not from birthright, but from integrity under duress. It teaches that even the most wounded among us can craft a legacy of goodwill that outlives the vicissitudes of power. As the soft breeze stirs the summer blooms around her tomb, one may almost hear Anne's whispered counsel: hold fast to kindness. Treat every soul with dignity. In that gentle whisper, the loneliest queen guides us still, urging each of us to cultivate compassion as our most enduring monument. Though King Henry VIII granted Anne of Cleves the freedom to marry again, she never once chose to don the mantle of bride a second time. For 17 years following her annulment in the year 1540, the young woman, now a wealthy and independent widow, in all but name remained steadfastly unmarried. Why did Anne, at the age of 23, possessing both fortune and autonomy, elect to live in solitude rather than embrace the companionship of a new union? Some historians suggest that the shock of her brief marriage to Henry VIII left Anne wary of love. She had arrived at Greenwich Palace with hope in her heart, only to endure a royal jilting so swift that within 6 months her title had been stripped and her body scrutinized for reasons as cold as any legal pretext. Such an ordeal, they argue, may have instilled in her a deep-seated fear of repeating the same humiliation. A second marriage, no matter how politically or financially advantageous, might have risked a repeat of that bitter lesson: trust misplaced, dignity compromised. Yet another perspective paints Anne as a woman who valued her independence above all else. Free from the demands of a husband's ambitions and the intrigues of courtly life, she managed her estates, Richmond Palace, Bletchingley Manor, and Hever Castle, with a degree of authority unusual for women of her time. She oversaw harvests, administered justice to her tenants, and directed charitable works. In the quiet of her private chapels and verdant gardens, she may have discovered a tranquility that no arranged match could promise. In choosing to remain single, Anne preserved the control of her own fate, unencumbered by the bonds of marital obligation. Rumour also whispered of a secret affection Anne nurtured for a figure who could never be hers. Some accounts, though, unverified by contemporary letters, speak of her heart's quiet devotion to a German confidant, a courtier or tutor who remained in Cleves when she departed for England in 1539. Such a sentiment, born of shared youth at Berg Castle, might have been too delicate to withstand the storms of dynastic politics. By foregoing a second marriage, Anne could have sought to protect her feelings from the risk of loss, shielding her tender memory from the cruelties of courtly rumour. Whatever the reason, Anne's unmarried life became part of her legend. Courtiers would glance at the maiden walks through the maze gardens of Richmond and murmur questions about her solitude. Gentlewomen whispered that she carried herself with a serene dignity, untroubled by the expectations that normally shadowed widowed princesses. Poets, years later, would liken her to a lonely swan, gliding across calm waters, her grace undiminished by the absence of a partner. This enduring mystery why Anne chose singlehood continues to stir reflection among scholars and dreamers alike. It raises questions about freedom and love, about whether true fulfillment lies in shared devotion or in the sovereignty of one's own soul. Anne's life reads like a lullaby rather than a tumultuous ballad. Gentle, unforced, yet imbued with depth for those who listen closely. Now, centuries on, the stone tombs of Westminster stand as silent sentinels to the intrigues of Tudor courts. Amid them, Anne's story resonates not with the clang of swords or the fervour of dynastic rivalry, but with the soft refrain of personal choice. Her legacy reminds us that authentic value resides not in the glitter of crowns or the vulnerability of public titles, but in the steadfastness of character and the compassion of one's deeds. In the hush that follows her life's final verse, we hear a whispered counsel, that we each may find solace in the freedom to shape our own destinies, to love cautiously or boldly as we choose, and to leave behind a memory defined by the warmth of our hearts rather than the weight of our offices. Anne of Cleves, the loneliest queen, by circumstance thus offers us a lullaby of resilience, a gentle assurance that even when history's cold stones forget our names, the quiet courage of our souls will not be lost to the night. Anne of Cleves drew her last breath on the 16th day of July in the year 1557, a mere 4 days after she had affixed her signature to the meticulous will that would guide her household long after her passing. Her frail body, having weathered the afflictions of advanced illness, was gently laid out and covered with the black mourning garments she herself had designated for her servants to don on the morrow. Word of her death spread swiftly through court and city alike, carried by heralds on horseback and whispered in the corridors of power. True to her promise and in tribute to Anne's final wishes, Queen Mary I, daughter and successor of King Henry VIII, personally selected the site of Anne's interment at Westminster Abbey, ensuring that the rites would follow the Catholic solemnity Anne had requested. On the evening before the funeral, a vigil was held around Anne's coffin in the Abbey's ancient Lady Chapel. Mourners, among them the highest nobility and senior clergy, kept watch by torchlight, the flickering flames casting long shadows on the vaulted stone ceilings. Chanting of the psalms and prayers for the dead echoed softly through the night, creating a hushed atmosphere of reverence. The vigil lasted until dawn, a full night of remembrance, allowing all who had served or admired Anne to pay their respects one final time. When morning broke on the 4th day of August in the year 1557, just over 3 weeks after Anne's passing, the abbey was draped in mourning banners of deep sable. Courtiers arrived in solemn procession, clad in robes of black, their hoods drawn low against the chill summer air. Bishops and abbots, wearing clerical vestments trimmed in violet, took their places near the high altar, while dukes and earls, peers of the realm, filed silently into their stalls. At precisely 9 o'clock, Anne's coffin was borne from Chelsea Manor on a bier of polished oak, its surface gleaming beneath a sombre pall. The cortege moved through the streets of London in near-silent reverence. Shopkeepers paused their morning trades, and labourers in the lanes fell silent as the procession passed. Upon reaching the Abbey's great west door, the coffin was reverently lifted and carried up the marble steps, 2 and 2, until it rested before the high altar. There, within the Abbey's southern crypt, reserved for only the most eminent of England's royalty and nobility, Anne was laid to rest. A simple stone slab was placed over her grave, unadorned by inscription, as though history itself had paused before committing her name to its annals. This blank memorial contrasted sharply with the ornate lavers and tombs surrounding it, emphasizing the quiet humility Anne had embodied in life. Throughout the funeral mass, tears glistened on many faces. Gentlewomen who had served Anne softly dabbed their eyes, and the hushed strains of the organ mingled with the weeping of those who recalled the once naive young princess arriving at Greenwich, her heart full of hope, and the compassionate lady she had become. Her life, marked by 17 years of dignified exile from the crown she never truly claimed, was honoured in each solemn note and whispered prayer. Though Anne's physical form lay hidden beneath cold stone, her spirit lingered in the memories of those present. They spoke in low tones of her generosity, how she had gifted her German attendants funds to return home, how she had provided for the poor children on her estates, and how she had placed the well-being of others above her own. In every recounting, her characteristic gentleness and steadfast kindness emerged, a testament to the woman known as the Queen without a crown. As the final blessing was pronounced and the clergy filed away, the Abbey's great doors opened to admit the bright morning light. The mourners paused to gaze upon the blank tomb, contemplating the paradox of a queen so honoured in death yet recorded in stone only by her absence of inscription. Even so, in the hearts of all who witnessed the ceremony, Anne of Cleves found her enduring epitaph, a life of quiet nobility, a legacy of compassion, and a final rest befitting one whose greatest reign was that of benevolence. In the centuries that followed Anne of Cleves's interment, her gravesite lay marked only by a simple slab of uninscribed stone. Pilgrims and visitors to Westminster Abbey passed over her resting place without knowing who lay beneath. It was only in the decade of the 1970s, amid a comprehensive restoration of the Abbey's medieval fabric, that historians uncovered Anne's blank tomb slab. During examinations of the ancient crypts, they realized that the monument bore no name or dates, an oversight both poignant and telling. Scholars and clergy, moved by this silent omission, resolved to rectify it. In the autumn of 1975, masons were commissioned to carve upon the stone the long-absent tribute, Anne of Cleves, Queen of England, born 1515, died 1557. This simple inscription not only restored Anne's rightful place in history, but also rekindled public interest in a royal figure long overshadowed by her more tumultuous counterparts. Tour guides paused at her tomb to recount the tale of the Queen without a crown, and visitors, once oblivious, began to linger in the dim light of the southern crypt, peering at the newly revealed epitaph. With Anne's name finally enshrined in stone, questions arose among both lay spectators and academic circles. Why had she chosen to remain unmarried for 17 years after her annulment? What compelled her to pour her resources into the welfare of her servants and the impoverished tenants on her estates? These inquiries prompted a wave of scholarly activity throughout the late 1970s and into the 1980s, as historians organized symposia and published articles aiming to reassess Anne's life and character. At one such conference, convened under the auspices of the Tudor Society at Oxford in 1978, a panel of experts argued that Anne's choices were far from accidental. Dr. Margaret Llewellyn, a leading authority on Tudor women, contended that Anne had demonstrated a strategic compassion that transcended mere noblesse oblige. She noted that Anne's bequests, allocating a year's wages to her 18 gentlewomen and 8 gentlemen, providing 40 shillings apiece for her 8 German attendants, and distributing £4 to each impoverished family on her manors, reflected a conscious effort to forge community bonds beyond the exigencies of courtly favour. Similarly, Professor Giles Harrington of the University of Cambridge delivered a paper suggesting that Anne's lifelong singleness functioned as a statement of autonomy. In her lecture halls afterwards, students debated whether Anne had deliberately declined subsequent marriage offers to preserve the authority she wielded as a landholder. By foregoing remarriage, Harrington argued, she ensured that the annual income of £4,000 and the use of Richmond Palace, Bletchingley Manor and Hever Castle remained under her sole control, rather than being absorbed into another husband's patrimony. Public fascination was not confined to academia. Documentaries began to feature Anne's story, and her tomb became the subject of magazine articles exploring the forgotten queen. In 2 special issues of the British History Review in 1979 and 1980, authors revisited the original letters exchanged between Thomas Cromwell and the Cleves court, hoping to discover traces of Anne's voice. While those letters proved sparse, the editors emphasized the significance of Anne's posthumous inscription, portraying it as a triumph of historical justice. By the early 1980s, tour guides at Westminster Abbey had incorporated Anne's narrative into their regular routes. Visitors, many unaware of her existence before their visit, now asked thoughtfully about her life. Was it true, they wondered, that she had gifted German servants enough coin to return home? And how had she balanced her status as the king's beloved sister with her discreet role as a beloved stepmother to Mary and Elizabeth? In 1982, a major exhibition titled Anne of Cleves, a Reappraisal, opened at the Museum of London. Curators assembled portraits, household inventories, and even fragments of her black mourning garments remnants, which had survived in a chest at Hever Castle. The exhibit drew record attendance, and its accompanying catalogue included essays by Dr. Llewellyn and Professor Harrington, whose earlier conference presentations now reached a wider audience. These renewed investigations portrayed Anne not as a passive victim of Tudor machinations, but as an individual of agency and benevolence. They underscored her skillful adaptation to the volatile religious landscape from her Protestant profession under Edward VI to her return to Catholic observance under Mary I, and later her alignment with the Elizabethan settlement. By adjusting her faith as circumstances required, she had secured both her material well-being and her moral integrity. Thus, the 17th century blank stone in Westminster Abbey became in the 20th century a catalyst for rediscovery. Anne's carved epitaph invited reflection on the nature of power, highlighting how a queen without issue or personal throne could nonetheless exert lasting influence through compassion and strategic independence. Her posthumous recognition through the carved tombstone served as a reminder that historical memory, once awakened, can illuminate virtues concealed by time and circumstance, virtues such as kindness, resilience, and the quiet assertion of one's own worth beyond titles and crowns. Though Anne of Cleves possessed no political authority by the end of her life, she bequeathed a spiritual legacy of remarkable breadth, boundless compassion, meticulous care, and an extraordinary adaptability to the harsh vicissitudes of her era. Her final will, dictated in the swelter of mid-July 1557, reveals a woman whose sense of responsibility extended to every soul in her service. Chief among these provisions was her tender concern for the German attendants who had journeyed with her from Cleves in the autumn of 1540. 8 servants, uprooted from their native land and thrust into the unfamiliar climate and courtly customs of England, were each granted 40 shillings. This sum, substantial at a time when a skilled craftsman earned perhaps 10 shillings per month, ensured their safe return home. In this act lay the essence of Anne's constancy. She remained true to those who had remained true to her, honouring bonds of loyalty that transcended language and distance. Such generosity did not end with those closest to her. Anne allocated £4 to every poor resident on her estates at Richmond, Bletchingley, Hever, and Dartford. An uncommon gesture in an age when few nobles acknowledged the plight of commoners. She specified that these funds be used not merely for immediate relief, but also to support the schooling of indigent children, thereby sowing seeds of opportunity that might blossom long after her earthly stewardship ended. Her will further directed charitable disbursements to the parishes of those manors, ensuring that the poorest received aid throughout the year. In this, Anne of Cleves demonstrated a Renaissance-era humanism rooted in action. Her piety manifested not in ostentatious endowments for grand churches, but in the quiet uplift of individual lives. Today, in libraries and museums across Britain and beyond, Anne's will is cited as a humanist manifesto of the 16th century. Historians paste facsimile reproductions of her handwritten stipulations into scholarly tomes, while educators include excerpts in textbooks to illustrate how true worth transcends station. Literary and dramatic writers draw inspiration from her story. Playwrights pen scenes that juxtapose the glitter of Tudor court with the warmth of Anne's final bequests. Novelists craft characters who, like Anne, choose moral principle over political expediency. These creative works frequently bear titles such as Beyond the Crown or The Queen of Kindness, underscoring a narrative far removed from the swords and thrones that dominate most accounts of the period. Moreover, living history groups dedicated to Tudor England regularly stage reenactments of Anne's funeral vigil at Westminster Abbey. These solemn ceremonies, often held on or around the anniversary of her burial, reconstruct the torchlit night watch documented in contemporary accounts. Volunteers clad in black mourning dress and clerical robes of violet process through the Abbey's Lady Chapel, chanting the same Latin psalms that once echoed beneath its vaulted ceilings. At dawn, they conduct a mock procession to the southern crypt, placing a replica stone slab over a symbolic tomb, thereby immersing the public in the hushed rituals of Tudor mourning. Such events draw historians and families alike, fostering a deeper appreciation for the personal dimensions of life at court dimensions, often overshadowed by dynastic drama. Indeed, Anne's significance lies not in the transient power she once wielded, but in the enduring human values she espoused. She navigated seismic shifts in religious doctrine, from Lutheran sympathy under her father's roof to Protestant conformity under Edward VI, then back to Catholic observance under Mary I, and again to Anglican settlement under Elizabeth I, demonstrating a survival strategy forged in early encounters with doctrinal plurality. Yet this flexibility never betrayed her underlying ethos of care. Whether petitioning for her former attendants, distributing alms, or ensuring her tenants' welfare, Anne consistently placed the well-being of others above her own advancement. This approach stands in stark contrast to many of her contemporaries. While Henry VIII's other wives are remembered for their tragic ends or political martyrdom, Anne's story resonates as one of quiet influence. She refused to let a broken marriage define her. Instead, she channeled her energies into benevolence and stewardship, crafting a legacy that outlasted any crown she wore. In so doing, she affirmed that the truest measure of sovereignty rests not in dominion over lands, but in dominion over the heart. As historians continue to excavate the dusty archives of Tudor England, Anne of Cleves's name surfaces with increasing frequency not as a footnote, but as a subject of serious study. Conferences on Renaissance humanism feature panels on her charitable innovations. Journals publish articles analyzing her will as a landmark in early modern social policy. Graduate seminars dissect her life as a case study in adaptive leadership, exploring how empathy and pragmatism can coexist in times of upheaval. Ultimately, Anne of Cleves's enduring lesson is timeless. Even in the absence of overt power, an individual's compassion can reshape lives and transcend centuries. Her bequests to servants and the poor, her investments in education, and her unwavering sense of loyalty offer a template for ethical conduct in any era. Though her reign without a crown spanned only 6 brief months, the spirit she embodied flourished across 17 years of royal exile and beyond, left to echo in the humanist declarations and living history pageants that celebrate her memory today. In the gentle refrain of her legacy, we find a lullaby of kindness, urging us always to remember that true greatness is measured by the warmth of the heart, not the weight of the scepter. Though King Henry VIII granted Anne of Cleves the legal freedom to marry again, she never walked down the aisle a second time. For 17 years following her annulment on the 9th day of July in the year 1540, this young woman, by then wealthy, unbound by political necessity, and still in the bloom of youth, remained steadfastly single. Why did Anne, at the age of 23, possessing ample fortune and autonomy, choose solitude over the companionship of a new union? Some scholars contend that the wounds inflicted during her brief marriage to Henry VIII ran too deep. Within 6 short months of her bridal entry into Greenwich Palace, on the 6th day of January 1540, Anne had endured public rejection, whispered courtly jests, and the stripping away of her royal title on the 9th day of July that same year. Such humiliation, they argue, seared her self-regard and instilled a profound wariness of love's risks. To marry again would have been to gamble her pride on a promise that might shatter just as swiftly. Others insist that Anne cherished her newly discovered independence more than any echo of marital security. No longer subject to the caprices of a husband's favour, she administered her estates at Richmond Palace, Bletchingley Manor, and Hever Castle with a measure of authority rare for noble women of the age. In overseeing harvests, adjudicating tenant disputes, and directing charitable endeavours, she found purpose and dignity. To wed once more would have meant exchanging that sovereignty for the familiar constraints of wifehood, an exchange she evidently found untenable. A more romantic theory holds that Anne harboured a concealed affection for a figure who could never be hers. Some accounts, though lacking direct contemporary testimony, suggest she silently loved a German confidant, perhaps a courtier or tutor who remained behind in Cleves when she departed for England in September 1539. In this interpretation, her unmarried state represented an act of fidelity, preserving her heart from further entanglement and protecting her tender memories from the harsh winds of court intrigue. Whatever the truth, Anne of Cleves's decision to remain single has become part of her mystique, inviting reflection on the nature of freedom and love. Her life reads like a gentle nocturne rather than a tempestuous epic, soft, unhurried, and suffused with quiet resolve. There are no recorded duels fought in her name, no conspiracies hatched beneath shadowed archways, only the steady rhythm of a woman choosing autonomy over alliance, duty over desire. This enduring enigma casts a hush over her story, much like the final bars of a lullaby that fade into silence, leaving only resonance. Visitors to the foundations of Richmond Palace sometimes pause to wonder at the stillness that Anne embraced, a stillness she shaped with her own hands, step by careful step. In the hushed corridors of Hever Castle, travellers speak of a presence felt more than seen, as though Anne's spirit lingers in the stone corridors she once paced in thoughtful solitude. In libraries and lecture halls, professors pose the lingering question: if offered the choice, would one pursue the intimate companionship of marriage or guard the sanctuary of one's own will? Anne's life provides no definitive answer, for her heart remained her own, undisclosed and unclaimed. Yet in that very secrecy lies her gift to posterity, a question hanging unanswered, urging each of us to consider the balance between the security of union and the liberty of the self. Thus, the story of Anne of Cleves concludes not with a flourish, but with a soft exhale. No final chapter depicts a triumphant remarriage or a sorrowful lament for lost love. Instead, her life's melody drifts into the night, peaceful and contemplative, inviting us to listen for its subtle cadences. In that serene stillness, Anne poses her quiet challenge across the centuries. If you stand at the crossroads, will you walk hand in hand, or will you walk freely alone?